Hey guys, welcome to the last part of our Unit 5 discussions here with the Civil War, and today we're going to be taking a look at the last part of our unit called Reconstruction. You can see here by the years, it is the last part of the Civil War all the way to 1877. What Reconstruction essentially is how are we going to reconstruct and readmit the southern states back into the Union. And by looking at the image here, we can see it's not going to be an easy task. From parts of the South that were completely destroyed using Sherman's total war to people in the South who do not still want to be readmitted back into the South or back into the Union, and people in the North who want to very much punish the South for what had happened during the Civil War. So there's a lot of obstacles. It's not as easy as some would have liked, like Abraham Lincoln, who just wants to bring the states back into the Union and then worry about things later. It will be a very tiresome process and much debate between different parts of the Republican Party and the federal government. So real quick, we take a look here. Some of the key questions to think about as we go through with Reconstruction, and there's going to be four of them. And the first one's going to be, how do we bring back the South into the Union? How do we get these southern states, these 11 states, to be fully ensconced in the Union and be a normal member just as all the other ones were already. Secondly, how do we rebuild the South after the destruction? Because as we know from the first picture that we saw on the title slide is that through Sherman's total war and even just through countless battles, there's going to be many cities who are completely destroyed with the new technologically advanced weaponry that was used because of industrialization. Thirdly, how do we integrate and protect the newly emancipated black freedmen? We know that during the Civil War, during the Emancipation Proclamation, that Lincoln was able to successfully free all black slaves in the southern states. So how are we going to make sure that those men can complete and keep their freedoms moving forward? And lastly, what branch of government should control the process of Reconstruction, because there's nowhere in the Constitution that really kind of develops this or talks about this because it was never planned for. So who are we going to give those powers to? Is it going to be the executive branch? Is it going to be the judicial branch? Or is it going to be the legislative branch? So we'll be sure to talk about this during class, but it's good to make sure that we know this moving forward, is that there are going to be three major goals that the federal government wants to create or answer during Reconstruction. The first of those being, how are we going to take care of the southern states moving forward? Again, how are we going to get them back into the Union? How are we going to protect those newly emancipated slaves? And how are we going to rebuild the South after all this fighting? So shortly upon the conclusion of the Civil War, President Lincoln is going to take it upon himself to kind of lay forward his plan for Reconstruction and how to bring back these southern states. Remember, this was his main goal from the very beginning. Up upon the time that he was elected president and when South Carolina was the first to secede, his major goal was to bring back the Union to make sure it was unified. So his policy, it was going to be more of a very charitable type. He has a famous quote being malice towards none and charity for all. So he is not going to be looking for vengeance. He's not going to be looking for punishments. He wants to just simply bring back the southern states and move forward. However, like we mentioned earlier, the Constitution has no guidelines on how to readmit states, so they're kind of doing this all on the fly. And different branches and different parts of different branches are going to very much disagree. Even people within Abraham Lincoln's party, he does not want to, or they do not want to give the same charitable donations the same way that Abraham Lincoln does. They want to make it a little bit tougher for these states. They want to punish them more. We'll see it with the radical Republicans who want to make it a very more difficult process for the southern states to kind of get justice for the war itself. So if we take a look here at Lincoln's plan very quickly, it's a very quick actioning plan. All that needs to be done is the Confederate States get 10% of their people to swear loyalty and oath to the United States, and they have to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. So by doing those two things, the states will be able to successfully be readmitted into the Union. However, there's a branch of the legislative party, a part of the legislative branch from the Republican Party that does not want to give the same easygoing plan that Lincoln does. So they're going to come up with a different plan. It's important to keep note the differences in these bills, the Lincoln plan versus the Wade Davis bill. And the Wade Davis bill favors more to protect blacks that were freed during the Civil War. 50% of the state citizens have to swear loyalty, not just 10%, and it also bans ex-Confederate leaders from serving in the government. So someone like Jefferson Davis, who was a Confederate leader, will never be able to serve in the United States government again. Same thing with any generals or so forth that were part of the Confederacy. Any leaders of the Confederate States are no longer welcome in the government. And the event that's really going to kind of stir the pot even more is that when Lincoln is assassinated, the government did not have a plan for Reconstruction put in place. So there's going to be a huge division between the people in the legislative branch and in the executive branch who favored the more Lincoln's plan versus the radical Republicans, as they become known, led by Thaddeus Stevens, who support the Wade Davis bill. So, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Vice President Andrew Johnson will become the new president, and he's going to put forth a plan called Presidential Reconstruction. And much like the Reconstruction of that of Abraham Lincoln, it's going to be a very far more lenient plan than that of the radical Republicans or the Wade Davis bill. President Andrew Johnson, who is also from the South, so keep this in mind, it kind of skews, I believe he's from Tennessee, also allows for him to be a little bit more lenient. He wants to try to admit these states as quickly as possible. He is seen more of a Jacksonian Democrat. He is very anti-aristocrat. He is more kind of like the the Andrew Jackson approach, where he's more of the common man's people. He is seen as a white supremacist, so he is not somebody who is an abolitionist or a free soiler the same way that the Republicans are, the same way that Abraham Lincoln was by any stretch. He agreed that Lincoln states should never have legally left the Union, and that's why he is trying to bring them back. So his major concern with the Civil War is not so much the protection of the blacks of the South, but of the states, getting them back into the Union. And you can see here in the quote that he says here, that "Damn the Negroes, I am fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters." This is kind of showing that he's blaming the blacks, for the freemen, for the fact that he has to go through this problem because he is fighting more the aristocrats from the southern states. So under presidential Reconstruction, any ex-Confederate states, so South Carolina, North Carolina, etc., they could rejoin the Union as long as they ratified the 13th Amendment. That was really the only criteria under Andrew Johnson's plan, and it did not provide any protections for former slaves under this plan. It was very different than the Wade Davis bill, which was very pro African American, while this one is more kind of just pro get states back into the Union as quickly as possible. And states are going to create these things called black codes, and we will look at an example of the Mississippi black code a little bit more in depth when we come in back to class. But these black codes were created by individual states as laws, as ways to keep black Americans more as second-class citizens, do anything they can to prevent them from gaining land, jobs, voting, etc., or having really any kind of protections under the law. In certain states, African Americans were not allowed to own guns because they were seen as they were unstable, or they were dangerous to the society by allowing them to own weapons. So then here are some more examples of what some of the black codes that were being pushed forward in southern states were going to become. Race was defined by your blood. That meant that any amount of black blood made one black. So if let's just say that you were a half, quarter, and eighth African American, then you were included in this as well. Employment was required of all freemen. So if you were somebody who did not work, you were considered a vagrancy, or basically you were committed on charges of not having a job. You could also not assemble in public without the presence of a white person, because that was seen as dangerous towards society. So these very racist laws are being put forth in the southern states under these black codes, under the presidential plan put forth by Andrew Johnson. So obviously, with the pushing of these black codes, the radical Republicans, are going to be very staunch abolitionists, and they are very against these black codes that are being pushed forward and Johnson's Reconstruction plan. They're going to try to create laws to go against these black codes in the southern states and try to push for the amendments that we would think of as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to try and create some sort of stability and some sort of equality in the southern states for these newly freed black men. So with that, one of the things they're going to create in 1865 is going to be the Freedmen's Bureau, which is going to be kind of like a safety net for the Southern blacks, as a way to kind of help them get back on their feet, to kind of start their lives and help them moving forward with their freedom. Some of the things they would provide them would be food, housing, medical supplies, any sort of needs that they might have in those realms. One of the famous lines that comes from this is that they would promise them 40 acres and a mule, meaning they would provide for them 40 acres of land and a mule to help with labor and so forth, so they could start their own farms and live subsistently, the same way that we talked about with the people moving westward during the westward expansion of Manifest Destiny. However, this was never delivered to them. They were also meant to kind of supervise labor contracts between whites and blacks in the South, and really one of the greatest legacies, or more of the most important legacies, from the Freedmen's Bureau was the creation of new schools in the South, especially with the segregation. And we'll talk about with Jim Crow laws that were being passed, that they were at least able to start up schools, these freedmen's schools, in the southern states. And you can see then with the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau, with the creation of new schools, that the population of students who are going to school is dramatically increasing from almost 0% to about 35% compared to that of the white populations as well in the southern states. So it is growing exponentially during this time period, during these following decades. And from this is going to be two words that kind of start to become part of Southern slander, or part of the Southern vernacular. These slanderous terms. One is carpetbaggers, and the other one is scalawags. And when we talk about carpetbaggers, they're referring to former abolitionists, so people who were from the North who would have moved down after the Civil War during the time of Reconstruction and were kind of seen as profiteers, people who were profiting off of helping blacks, part of these freedmen's bureaus. So the people of the South who resented this were called them carpetbaggers, kind of referring to them as somebody who just came down here for the profit motives rather than the abolition movements. And the other term, scalawags, would be another derogatory term towards Southerners who were more abolitionists, or at least more pro to helping the Southern blacks. And with this push then for education, then we can see here with the Freedmen's Bureau, it was not just elementary or high school education, but also in colleges and what we would consider like the HBCs, the historically black colleges. We can see being popped up all throughout the southern states, these colleges for black men especially, and then eventually black women as well, to kind of come together to, again, try to emphasize the education to help them moving forward in later generations. So even with the Freedmen's Bureau, the radical Republicans were still fearful that Johnson's plan was going to violate the black civil rights, that these black codes that were being established in southern states were going to be a violation of civil rights. So what they did, they drafted and eventually will pass the 14th Amendment, which included former slaves as citizens and guaranteed all citizens equal rights under the protection of the law. So at this point then, our anti-slavery laws, or our Reconstruction laws that we should know, are the 13th Amendment, which guarantees the abolition of slavery. We have the 14th Amendment, which extends full citizenship to African Americans. So looking at it from the other perspective, then after the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be created and the 14th Amendment is going to be drafted, from Andrew Johnson's perspective, remember his main goal is to get these southern states admitted as quickly as possible. And he believes that both of these, the Freedmen's Bureau and the 14th Amendment, are going to hinder his ability to do so. He is threatening to veto the 14th Amendment, and he is also encouraging southern states to not ratify the 14th Amendment, so that way the northern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, so the southern states would not have to they would not have to abide by, or they would not have to swear allegiance to it as well in order to be restated back into the Union. And by seeing this, the radical Republicans and in Congress, they realized that they need to take control of Reconstruction. They need to take this away from the president, and that's going to push forward to their plan that they're going to come up with called Congressional Reconstruction, which is going to be very, very similar to that of the Wade Davis bill. It's going to be a lot stricter on the southern states. It's going to do a better job of trying to protect the rights of former slaves, and it's also going to keep Confederate leaders from regaining power in the South and also in the federal government. So from here, then, the Congress will pass the Reconstruction Act of 1867. And what this essentially does here, it breaks up the South into 5 military zones, and you can see where they are pictured here on the map, where Virginia is one, and then North and South Carolina is the second one, and then you can see the other ones that follow. Now, with that, what that essentially is that the military will go down and enforce, almost kind of like a National Guard type, or a police force, where they're making sure to enforce that black men are given the same rights and that they are given equal rights under the 13th and 14th Amendments in the different states of the South. And ex-Confederate states were required to give them the right to vote at the state level. To be readmitted, then, the states are going to have to ratify the 14th Amendment protecting black citizenship. So the same things that Andrew Johnson does not want are being forced in order to get these southern states to be readmitted under the Reconstruction Act. So this is where the debate, or this is where the issues are going to come in for President Andrew Johnson, because if you are him, remember, you want to make this process as easy as possible, and you see that this military action as a sign of aggression towards southern states, and in order to kind of block this, he is going to fire military generals that are appointed by Congress under these military zones. Again, just trying to be the thorn in their sides, making this process as hard as possible for the for the radical Republicans overseeing the Southern Reconstruction plans.